We try and be the best in a game that has no agreed upon objectives or agreed upon metrics or timeframes. There's a few consistent and predictable outcomes: the decline of trust, the decline of cooperation, the decline of innovation. And I find this fascinating because so many of the ways that we run most organizations is with a finite mindset.
So trying to reduce the beautiful, complex thing that is life, or politics or business, into something very narrow. And in that process, the reductionist process, you lose something fundamental that makes the whole thing work in the long term. So returning, I'm not going to let you off the hook easy. What is the meaning of life? So what is the objective function that is worthwhile to pursue?
Well, if you think about our tombstones, right? They have the date we were born and the date we died. But really it's what we do with the gap in between. There's a poem called The Dash. It's the dash that matters. It's what we do between the time we're born and the time we die that gives our life meaning. And if we live our lives with a finite mindset, which means to accumulate more power or money than anybody else, to outdo everyone else, to be number one, to be the best, we don't take any of it with us. We just die. The people who get remembered, the way we want to be remembered is what kind of people we were, right? Devoted mother, loving father, what kind of person we were to other people. Jack Welch just died recently, and the Washington Post, when it wrote the headline for his obit, it wrote, "He pleased Wall Street and distressed employees." And that's his legacy. A finite player who is obsessed with winning,
yes,
who leaves behind a legacy of short-term gains for a few and distress for many. That's his legacy. And every single one of us gets the choice of the kind of legacy we want to have. Do we want to be remembered for our contributions or our detractions? To live with a finite mindset, to live a career with a finite mindset, to be number one, be the best, be the most famous, you live a life like Jack Welch, to live a life of service, to see those around us rise, to contribute to our communities, to our organizations, to leave them in better shape than we found them. That's the kind of legacy most of us would like to have.
So day to day, when you think about what is the fundamental goals, dreams, motivations of an infinite game, of seeing your life, your career as an infinite game, what does that look like? I mean, I guess I'm sort of trying to stick on this personal ego, personal drive, the thing that the fire, the reason we want to wake up in the morning, and the reason we can't go to bed because we're so excited. What is that?
So for me, it's about having a just cause. It's about a vision that's bigger than me. That my work gets to contribute to something larger than myself. That's what drives me every day. I wake up every morning with a vision of a world that does not yet exist, a world in which the vast majority of people wake up every single morning inspired, feel safe at work, and return home fulfilled at the end of the day. It's not the world we live in. And so that we still have work to do is the thing that drives me. I know what my underlying values are. I wake up to inspire people to do the things that inspire them. And these are my go-tos, my touch points. That inspire me to keep working. I think of a career like an iceberg. If you have a vision for something, you're the only one who can see the iceberg underneath the ocean. But if you start working at it, a little bit shows up. And now a few other people can see what you imagine, be like, oh, right, yeah, no, I want to help build that as well. And if you have a lot of success, then you have a lot of iceberg. And people can see this huge iceberg and they say, you've accomplished so much. But what I see is all the work still yet to be done. Yet I still see the huge iceberg underneath the ocean.
And so the growth, you talk about momentum, so the incremental revealing of the iceberg is what drives you.
Well, it necessarily is incremental. What drives me is the realization, is realizing the iceberg, bringing more of the iceberg from the unknown to the known, bringing more of the vision from the imagination to reality.
And you have this fundamental vision of optimism. You call yourself an optimist. In this world, I see myself a little bit as the main character from The Idiot by Dostoevsky, who's also kind of seen by society as a fool because he was optimistic. So, one, can you maybe articulate where that sense of optimism comes from, and maybe also try to articulate your vision of the future where people are inspired or optimism drives us.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget that when you look at social media and so on, where the word toxicity and negativity can often get more likes.
Yeah.
That optimism has a sort of a beauty to it, and I do hope it's out there. So, what can you try to articulate that vision?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, optimism and being an optimist is just seeing the silver lining in every cloud. You know, even in tragedy, it brings people together. And the question is, can we see that? Can you see the beauty that is in everything? I don't think optimism is foolishness. I don't think optimism is blindness, though it probably involves some naivete, the belief that things will get better, the belief that we tend towards the good, even in times of struggle or bad. You know, you can't sustain war, but you can sustain peace. You know, I think things that are stable are more sustainable. Things that are optimistic are more sustainable than things that are, you know, chaotic.
Do you see people as fundamentally good? I mean, some people may disagree that you can sustain peace, you can't sustain war.
I mean, you don't have to. I think war is costly. You know, it involves life and money, and peace does not involve those things. It requires work. I'm not saying it doesn't require work, but it doesn't drain resources, I think, the same way that war does.
You know, the people that would say that we will always have war, and I just talked to the historian of Stalin, is, you know, would say that conflict and the desire for power and conflict is central to human nature.
I concur.
But something in your words also, perhaps it's the naive aspect that I also share, is that you have an optimism that people are fundamentally good. And
I'm an idealist, you know, and I think idealism is good. I'm not a fool to believe that the ideals that I imagine can come true. Of course, there'll never be world peace, but shouldn't we die trying? You know, I think that's the whole point. That's the whole point of vision. Vision should be idealistic, and it should be, for all practical purposes, impossible. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And it's the milestones that we reach that take us closer to that ideal, that make us feel that our life and our work have meaning and we're contributing to something bigger than ourselves. You know, we just because it's impossible doesn't mean we shouldn't try. As I said, we're still moving the ball down the field. We're still making progress. Things are still getting better, even if we never get to that ideal state. So I think idealism is a good thing.
You know, in the word infinite game, one of the beautiful and tragic aspects of life, human life at least from the biological perspective, is that it ends. So sadly, it's
To some people, yeah.
finite. It's tragic to some people, or is it ends? It ends.
I think some people believe that it ends on the day you die, and some people think it continues on.
There's a lot of different ways to think what continues on even
Right.
looks like. But let me drag it back to the personal,
Sure.
which is how do you think about your own mortality? Are you afraid of death? How do you think about your own death?
I definitely haven't accomplished everything I want to contribute to. I would like more time on this earth to keep working towards that vision.
Do you think about the fact that it ends for you? Are you cognizant of
Of course, I'm cognizant of it. I mean, aren't we all? I don't dwell on it. I'm aware of it. I know that my life is finite, and I know that I have a certain amount of time left on this planet, and I'd like to make that time be valuable.
You know, some people would think that ideas kind of allow you to have a certain kind of immortality.
Yeah.
Maybe to linger on this kind of question, so first to push back on, you said that everyone's cognizant of their mortality. There's a guy named Ernest Becker who would disagree, that you basically say that most of human cognition is created by us trying to create an illusion and try to hide the fact from ourselves, the fact that we're going to die. We try to think that it's all going to go on forever.
But the fact that we know that it doesn't.
Yes, but this mix of denial, I mean, I think the book's called Denial of Death.
Yeah.
It's this constant denial that we're running away from. That's, in fact, some would argue that the inspiration, the incredible ideas you put out there, your TED Talk has been seen by millions and millions of people, right? It's just you trying to desperately fight the fact that you are biologically mortal, and your creative genius comes from the fact that you're trying to create ideas that live on long past you.
Well, that's very nice of you. I mean, I would like my ideas to live on beyond me, because I think that is a good test that those ideas have value in the lives of others. I think that's a good test that others would continue to talk about or share the ideas long after I'm gone. I think is perhaps the greatest compliment one can get for one's own work. But I don't think it's my awareness of my mortality that drives me to do it. It's my desire to contribute that drives me to do it.
It's the optimist vision. It's the pleasure and the fulfillment you get from inspiring others. It's as pure as that. Let me ask. Listen, I'm Russian. I'm trying to get
You're good. I'm enjoying it.
Get you into these dark
You're
areas.
good. I'm enjoying it.
Is the ego tied up into it somehow? So your name is extremely well known. If your name wasn't attached to it, do you think you would act differently?
I mean, for years I hated that my name was attached to it. You know, I had a rule for years that I wouldn't have my face on the cover, the front page of the website. You know, I had a fight with the publisher because I didn't want my name big on the book. I wanted it tiny on the book because I kept telling them it's not about me, it's about the ideas. They wanted to put my name on the top of my book. I refused. None of my books have my names on the top because I won't let them. They would like very much to put my name on the top of the book, but the idea has to be bigger than me. I'm not bigger than the idea.
It's beautifully put. Do you think ego?
But I also am aware that I'm become recognized as the messenger. And even though I still think the message is bigger than me, I recognize that I have a responsibility as the messenger. And whether I like it or not is irrelevant. I accept the responsibility. I'm happy to do it.
I'm not sure how to phrase this, but there's a large part of the culture right now that emphasizes all the things that nobody disagrees with, which is health, sleep, diet, relaxation, meditation, vacation, are really important. And there's no, it's like you can't really argue against that. In fact, people
Less sleep.
less.
I'm joking.
Yes, well, that's the thing. I often speak to the fact that passion and love for what you're doing, and the two words hard work, especially in the engineering fields, are more important to prioritize than sleep. Even though sleep is really important, your mind should be obsessed with the hard work, with the passion, and so on. And then I get some pushback, of course, from people. What do you make sense of that? Is that just me, the crazy Russian engineer, really pushing hard work?
Probably. I think that's a short-term strategy. I think if you sacrifice your health for the work, at some point it catches up with you, and at some point it's like going, and you get sick. Your body will shut down for you if you refuse to take care of yourself. You get sick. It's what happens. Sometimes, more severe illness than something that just slows you down. So I think getting sleep. I mean, there've been studies on this that, executives, for example, who get a full night's sleep and stop at a reasonable hour actually accomplish more, are more productive than people who work and burn the midnight oil because their brains are working better because they're well rested. So, working hard, yes, but why not work smart? I think that giving our minds and our bodies rest makes us more efficient. I think just driving is a short-term strategy.
So, but to push back on that a little bit, so the annoying thing is you're like 100% right in terms of science, right? But the thing is, it's because you're 100% right, that weak part of your mind uses that fact to convince you, like what, so, I get all kinds of, my mind comes up with all kinds of excuses to try to convince me that I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
To rationalize.
Sure. And so what I have a sense, I think what you said about executives and leaders is absolutely right. But there's the early days of madness and passion.
For sure.
Then I feel like emphasizing sleep, as thinking about sleep as giving yourself a way out from the fact that those early days, especially, can be suffering.
As long it's not sustainable.
Right.
It's not sustainable. Sure, if you're investing all that energy in something at the beginning to get it up and running, then at some point you're going to have to slow down, or your body will slow you down for you. Like, you can choose, or your body can choose. I mean,
So you don't think, from my perspective, it feels like people have gotten a little bit soft, but you're saying no.
no, I think that there seems evidence that working harder and later have taken a back seat. I think we have to be careful with broad generalizations, but I think if you go into the workplace, there are people who would complain that more people now than before, look at their watches and say, "Oh, it's 5 o'clock, go by." Right? Now, is that a problem with the people? You're saying it's that people giving themselves excuses and people don't work hard, or is it the organizations aren't giving them something to believe in, something to be passionate about? We can't manufacture passion. You can't just tell someone, be passionate. That's not how it works. Passion's an output, not an input. Like if I believe in something and I want to contribute all that energy to do it, we call that passion. Working hard for something we love is passion. Working hard for something we don't care about is called stress. But we're working hard either way. So I think the organizations bear some accountability, and our leaders bear some accountability, which is if they're not offering a sense of purpose, if they're not offering us a sense of cause, if they're not telling us that our work is worth more than simply the money it makes, then yeah, I'm going to come at 5 o'clock because I don't really care about making you money. Remember, we live in a world right now where a lot of people, rather a few people, are getting rich on the hard work of others. And so I think when people look up and say, well, why would I do that? I'll just, if you're not going to look after me, and then you're going to lay me off at the end of the year because you missed your arbitrary projections, you're going to lay me off because you missed your arbitrary projections, then why would I offer my hard work and loyalty to you? So I don't think we can immediately blame people for going soft. I think we can blame leaders for their inability or failure to offer their people something bigger than making a product or making money.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And start with Why Leaders Eat Last. Your books, you basically talk about what it takes to be a good leader. And so some of the blame should go on the leader, but how much of it is on finding your passion? How much is it on the individual? And allowing yourself to pursue that passion, pushing yourself to your limits to really take concrete steps along your path towards that passion.
Yeah, there's mutual responsibility. There's mutual accountability. I mean, we're responsible as individuals to find the organizations and find the leaders that inspire us. And organizations are responsible for maintaining that flame and giving people who believe what they believed, a chance to contribute.
Sort of to linger on it, have you by chance seen the movie Whiplash?
Yes.
Again, maybe I'm romanticizing suffering. Again,
it's the Russian in you.
It's the Russian.
Yeah, the Russians love suffering.
But so for people who haven't seen, it's the movie Whiplash as a drum instructor that pushes the drum musician to his limits to bring out the best in him. And there's a toxic nature to it. There's suffering in it. Like you've worked with a lot of great leaders, a lot of great individuals. So what is that toxic relationship as toxic as it appears in the movie, or is that fundamental? I've seen that relationship, especially in the past, with Olympic athletes, especially in athletics, extreme performers, seem to do wonders. It does wonders for me. There's some of them are my best relationships. Now, I'm not representative of everyone's, but some of my best relationships for mentee and mentor have been toxic from an external perspective. What do you make of that movie? What do you make of that kind of relationship?
That's not my favorite movie.
Okay. So you don't think that's a healthy, you don't think that kind of relationship is a great example of a great
I think
leader?
it's a short-term strategy. I mean,
Short-term.
I mean, look, being hard on someone is not the same as toxicity. If you go to the Marine Corps, a drill instructor will be very hard on their Marines, but still, even on the last day of boot camp, they'll take their hat off and they'll become a human. But the of all the drill instructors, the the 3 or 4 main drill instructors assigned to a group of recruits, the one that they all want the respect of is the one that's the hardest on them. That's true. And you hear, there's plenty of stories of people who want to earn the respect of a hard parent or a hard teacher. But fundamental, that parent, that teacher, that drill instructor has to believe in that person, has to see potential in them. It's not a formula, which is if I'm hard on people, they'll do well, which is there has to still be love. It has to be done with absolute love, and it has to be done responsibly. I mean, some people can take a little more pressure than others, but it's not. I think it's irresponsible to think of it as a formula. That if I'm just toxic at people, they will do well. It depends on their personalities. First of all, that works for some, but not all. And second of all, it can't be done willy-nilly. It has to still be done with care and love, and sometimes you can get equal or better results without all of the toxicity. So
one of the, I guess, toxicity on my part was a really bad word to use. But if we talk about what makes a good leader, and just look at an example in particular, looking at Elon Musk, he's known to push people to their limits in a way that I think really challenges people in a way they've never been challenged before, to do the impossible.
Sure.
But it can really break people.
And Jobs was hard, and Amazon is hard, and but the thing that's important is none of them lie about it. People ask me about Amazon all the time. Like, Jeff Bezos never lied about it. Even the ones who like Amazon don't last more than a couple of years before they burn out. But when we're honest about the culture, then it gives people the opportunity who like to work in that kind of culture to choose to work in that kind of culture, as opposed to pretending and saying, "Oh no, this is all it's all lovey-lovey here," and then you show up and it's the furthest thing from it. So I mean, I think the reputations of putting a lot of pressure on people to, Jobs was not an easy man to work for. He pushed people, but everyone who worked there was given the space to create and do things that they would not have been able to do anywhere else, and work at a level that they didn't work anywhere else. And Jobs didn't have all the answers. I mean, he pushed his people to come up with answers. He wasn't just looking for people to execute his ideas. And people did. People accomplished more than they thought they were capable of, which is wonderful.
How do you're talking about the infinite game and not thinking about too short term, and yet you see some of the most brilliant people in the world being pushed by Elon Musk to accomplish some of the most incredible things. When we're talking about autopilot, when we're talking about some of the hardware engineering, they do some of the best work of their life and then leave. How do you balance that in terms of what it takes to be a good leader, what it takes to accomplish great things in your life?
Yeah. So I think there's a difference between someone who can get a lot out of people in the short term, and building an organization that can sustain beyond any individual. There's a difference.
When you say beyond any individual, you mean beyond, like if the leader dies.
Correct. Like could Tesla continue to do what it's doing without Elon Musk?
And you're perhaps implying, which is a very interesting question, that it cannot.
I don't know. The argument you're making of this person who pushes everyone, arguably is not a repeatable model, right? Is Apple the same without Steve Jobs, or is it slowly moving in a different direction? Or has he established something that could be resurrected with the right leader?
That was his dream, I think, is to have to build an organization that lives on beyond them. At least I remember reading that somewhere.
I think that's what a lot of leaders desire, which is to create something that was bigger than them. Most businesses, most entrepreneurial ventures could not pass the school bus test, which is, if the founder was hit by a school bus, would everyone continue the business without them, or would they all just go find jobs? And the vast majority of companies would fail that test, especially in the entrepreneurial world. That if you take the inspired visionary leader away, the whole thing collapses. So is that a business, or is that just a force of personality? And a lot of entrepreneurs, face that reality, which is they have to be in every meeting, make every decision, come up with every idea, because if they don't, who will? And the question is, well, what have you done to build your bench? It's not, sometimes it's ego, the belief that only I can. Sometimes it's just things did so well for so long that you just forgot. And sometimes it's a failure to build the training programs or hire the right people that could replace you, who are maybe smarter and better. And browbeating people is only one strategy. I don't think it's necessarily the only strategy, nor is it always the best strategy. I think people get to choose the cultures they want to work in. So this is why I think companies should be honest about the kind of culture that they've created. You know, I heard a story about Apple where somebody came in from a big company. You know, he had accomplished a lot and his ego was very large, and he was going on about how he did this and he did that and he did this and he did that. And somebody from Apple said, "We don't care what you've done. The question is, what are you going to do?" And that's you know, for somebody who wants to be pushed, that's the place you go, because you choose to be pushed. Now, we all want to be pushed to some degree. You know, anybody who wants to accomplish anything in this world wants to be pushed to some degree, whether it's through self-pressure or external pressure or, you know, public pressure, whatever it is. But I think this whole idea of one size fits all is a false narrative of how leadership works. But what all leadership requires is creating an environment in which people can work at their natural best.
But you have a sense that it's possible to create a business where it lives on beyond you. So if we look at now, if we just look at this current moment, I just recently talked to Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, and he's under a lot of pressure now. I don't know if you're aware of the news that he's being pushed out as potentially as the CEO of Twitter, because he's the CEO already of an incredibly successful company. Plus, he wants to go to Africa to live a few months in Africa to connect with the world that's outside of Silicon Valley, and sort of there's this idea: well, can Twitter live without Jack?
We'll find out.
But you have a general, as a student of great leadership, you have a general sense that it's possible.
Yeah, of course it's possible. I mean, what Bill Gates built with Microsoft may not have survived Steve Ballmer if the company weren't so rich. But Satya Nadella is putting it back on track again. It's become a visionary company again. It's attracting great talent again. It went through a period where they couldn't get the best talent, and the best talent was leaving. Now people want to work for Microsoft again. Well, that's not because of pressure. Ballmer put more pressure on people, mainly to hit numbers, than anything else. That didn't work, right? And so the question is what kind of pressure are we putting on people? Are we putting on people to hit numbers or hit arbitrary deadlines, or are we putting on pressure on people because we believe that they can do better work? And the work that we're trying to do is to advance a vision that's bigger than all of us. And if you're going to put pressure on people, it better be for the right reason. Like, if you're going to put pressure on me, it better be for a worthwhile reason. If it's just to hit a goal, if it's just to hit some arbitrary date or some arbitrary number or make a stock price hit some target, you can keep it. I'm out of here. Yes. But if you want to put pressure on me because we are brothers and sisters in arms, working to advance a cause bigger than ourselves, that we believe whatever we're going to build will significantly contribute to the greater good of society, then go ahead, I'll take the pressure. And if you look at the Apples, and if you look at the Elon Musks, you know, the Jobs and the Elon Musks, they fundamentally believed that what they were doing would improve society and it was for the good of humankind. And so the pressure, in other words, the what they were doing was more important, more valuable than any individual on the team. And so the pressure they put on people served a greater good. And so we looked to the left and we looked to the right to each other and said, we're in this together. We accept this. We want this. But if it's just pressure to hit a number or, you know, make the widget move a little faster, that's soul-sucking. That's not passion. That's stress. And I think a lot of leaders confuse that making people work hard is not what makes them passionate. Giving them something to believe in and work on is what drives passion.
And when you have that, then turning up the pressure only brings people together, drives them further.
If done the right way.
Done the right way. Speaking of pressure, I'm gonna give you 90 seconds to answer the last question, which is if I told you that tomorrow was your last day to live. We talked about mortality, sunrise to sunset. Can you take me through the day? What do you think that day would involve? You can't spend it with your family. I told you as well.
I would probably want to fill all of my senses with things that excite my senses. I'd want to look at beautiful art. I'd want to listen to beautiful music. I'd want to taste incredible food. I'd want to smell amazing tastes. I'd want to touch, something that, something beautiful to touch. I'd want all of my senses to just be consumed with things that I find beautiful.
And you talked about this idea of, we don't do it often these days, of just listening to music, turning off all the devices and actually taking in and listening to music. So as a addendum, if we were to talk about music, what song would you be blasting on this last day you're alive? Is it Led Zeppelin? What are we talking about?
That I love? No. There's probably going to be a Beatles song in there. There'll definitely be some Beethoven in there.
The classics.
The classics.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you for making time for it. Under pressure, we made it happen.
Yeah, it was great.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Simon Sinek. And thank you to our sponsors, Cash App and Masterclass. Please consider supporting the podcast by downloading Cash App and using code LEXPODCAST and signing up to Masterclass at masterclass.com/Lex. If you enjoy this podcast, subscribe on YouTube, review it with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, support it on Patreon, or simply connect with me on Twitter at Lex Friedman. And now, let me leave you with some words from Simon Sinek. There are only 2 ways to influence human behavior. You can manipulate it, or you can inspire it. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time. The following is a conversation with Anka Dragan, a professor at Berkeley working on human-robot interaction, algorithms that look beyond the robot's function in isolation and generate robot behavior that accounts for interaction and coordination with human beings. She also consults at Waymo, the autonomous vehicle company, but in this conversation, she's 100% wearing her Berkeley hat. She is one of the most brilliant and fun roboticists in the world to talk with. I had a tough and crazy day leading up to this conversation, so I was a bit tired, even more so than usual. But almost immediately as she walked in, her energy, passion, and excitement for human-robot interaction was contagious. So I had a lot of fun and really enjoyed this conversation. This is the Artificial Intelligence Podcast. If you enjoy it, subscribe on YouTube, review it with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, support it on Patreon, or simply connect with me on Twitter at Lex Friedman, spelled Fridman. As usual, I'll do 1 or 2 minutes of ads now, and never any ads in the middle that can break the flow of the conversation. I hope that works for you and doesn't hurt the listening experience. This show is presented by Cash App, the #1 finance app in the App Store. When you get it, use code LEXPODCAST. Cash App lets you send money to friends, buy Bitcoin, and invest in the stock market with as little as $1. Since Cash App does fractional share trading, let me mention that the order execution algorithm that works behind the scenes to create the abstraction of fractional orders is an algorithmic marvel. The big props to the Cash App engineers for solving a hard problem that in the end provides an easy interface that takes a step up to the next layer of abstraction over the stock market, making trading more accessible for new investors and diversification much easier. So again, if you get Cash App from the App Store or Google Play and use the code LEXPODCAST, you get $10, and Cash App will also donate $10 to FIRST, an organization that is helping to advance robotics and STEM education for young people around the world. And now, here's my conversation with Anka Dragan. When did you first fall in love with robotics?
I think it was a very gradual process, and it was somewhat accidental, actually, because I first started getting into programming when I was a kid, and then into math, and then into I decided computer science was the thing I was going to do. And then in college, I got into AI. And then I applied to the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon. And I was coming from this little school in Germany that nobody had heard of. But I had spent an exchange semester at Carnegie Mellon. So I had letters from Carnegie Mellon. So that was the only place, MIT said no, Berkeley said no, Stanford said no. That was the only place I got into. So I went there to the Robotics Institute. And I thought that robotics is a really cool way to actually apply the stuff that I knew and loved, like optimization. So that's how I got into robotics. I have a better story how I got into cars, which is I used to do mostly manipulation in my PhD, but now I do kind of a bit of everything application-wise, including cars. And I got into cars because I was here in Berkeley while I was a PhD student still for RSS 2014. Peter Bill organized it. And he arranged it was Google at the time, to give us rides in self-driving cars. And I was in a robot. And it was just making decision after decision the right call. And it was so amazing. So it was a whole different experience, right? Manipulation is so hard, you can't do anything. And there it was.
Was it the most magical robot you've ever met? So like, for me too, meeting Google's self-driving car for the first time was like a transformative moment. Like I had two moments like that and Spot Mini. I don't know if you met Spot Mini from Boston Dynamics. I felt like I fell in love or something. Like because I thought, like, I know how a Spot Mini works, right? It's just, there's nothing truly special. It's great engineering work, but the anthropomorphism that went on into my brain, like it came to life. Like it had a little arm and it looked at me. She looked at me. I don't know. There's a magical connection there, and it made me realize, wow, robots can be so much more than things that manipulate objects. They can be things that have a human connection. Was the self-driving car the moment? Like, was there a robot that truly sort of inspired you?
I remember that experience very viscerally, riding in that car and being just wowed. They gave us a sticker that said I rode in a self-driving car, and it had this cute little firefly on, or logo or something.
Oh, that was like the smaller one, like the firefly.
Yeah, the really cute one. Yeah, and I put it on my laptop, and I had that for years until I finally changed my laptop out, and
What about if we walk back? You mentioned optimization. Like what beautiful ideas inspired you in math, computer science early on? Like, why get into this field? It seems like a cold and boring field of math. Like, what was exciting to you about it?
The thing is, I liked math from very early on. From 5th grade is when I got into the Math Olympiad and all of that.
Oh, you competed too?
Yeah, in Romania, it's like our national sport. You gotta understand. So I got into that fairly early, and it was maybe too just theory with no kind of. I didn't really have a goal. And other than understanding, which was cool, I always liked learning and understanding, but there was no, okay, what am I applying this understanding to? And so I think that's how I got more heavily into computer science, because it was kind of math meets something you can do tangibly in the world.
Do you remember like the first program you've written?
Okay, the first program I've written I kind of do. It was in QBasic in 4th grade.
Wow.
and it was drawing like a circle or a square. Yeah. I don't know how to do that anymore. But in 4th grade, that's like the first thing that they taught me. It was like you could take a special, I wouldn't say it was an extracurricular, it's in a sense an extracurricular. So you could sign up for, dance or music or program. And I did the programming thing. And my mom was like, what? Why?
Did you compete in program? Like these days, Romania probably, that's like a big thing. There's a programming competition. Did that touch you at all?
I did a little bit of the computer science Olympiad, but not as seriously as I did the math Olympiad. So it was programming. Yeah, it's basically, here's a hard math problem, solve it with a computer. It was kind of the deal.
Yeah, it's more like algorithms.
Exactly, it's always algorithmic.
So, again, you kind of mentioned the Google self-driving car, but outside of that, or what's like who or what is your favorite robot, real or fictional, that like captivated your imagination throughout? I mean, I guess you kind of alluded to the Google self-driving. The Firefly was a magical moment, but is there something else? Is
It
there
wasn't the
other
Firefly there. It was, I think there was the Lexus, by the way. This was back then. But yeah, so good question. My favorite fictional robot is Wally. And I love how amazingly expressive it is. I'm a person who thinks a little bit about expressive motion kinds of things you were saying with you can do this and it's a head and it's the manipulator and what does it all mean. I like to think about that stuff. I love Pixar. I love animation. I love
Wally has two big eyes, I think, or no?
Yeah, it has these cameras and they move. So yeah, it goes and then it's super cute. It's the way it moves is just so expressive. The timing of that motion, what it's doing with its arms and what it's doing with these lenses is amazing. And so I've really liked that from the start. And then on top of that, sometimes I share this. It's a personal story I share with people or when I teach about AI or whatnot. My husband proposed to me by building a Wally, and he actuated it so it's 7 degrees of freedom, including the lens thing, and it kind of came in and he made it have like a the belly box opening thing, so it just did that, and then it spewed out this box made out of Legos that opened slowly, and then bam.
No.
Yeah, it was quite. It set a bar.
That could be like the most impressive thing I've ever heard. Okay.
So I have a special connection to Wally. Long story short, I like Wally because I like animation and I like robots and I like the fact that we still have this robot to this day.
How hard is that problem, do you think, of the expressivity of robots? Like with the Boston Dynamics, I never talked to those folks about this particular element. I've talked to them a lot, but it seems to be like almost an accidental side effect for them, that they weren't. I don't know if they're faking it. They weren't trying to. Okay, they do say that the gripper it was not intended to be a face. I don't know if that's an honest statement, but I think they're legitimate.
Probably is.
But so do we automatically just anthropomorphize anything we can see about a robot? So like the question is, how hard is it to create a Wall-E type robot that connects so deeply with us humans? What do you think?
It's really hard, right? So it depends on what setting. So if you want to do it in this very particular narrow setting where it does only one thing and it's expressive, then you can get an animator. You can have Pixar on call come in, design some trajectories. There was Anki had a robot called Cosmo where they put in some of these animations. That part is easy, right? The hard part is doing it not via these kind of handcrafted behaviors, but doing it generally autonomously. Like I want robots. I don't work on, just to clarify, I used to work a lot on this. I don't work on that quite as much these days, but have the notion of having robots that, when they pick something up and put it in a place, they can do that with various forms of style, or you can say, well, this robot is, succeeding at this task and is confident versus it's hesitant versus, maybe it's happy or it's, disappointed about some failure that it had. Or I think that when robots move, they can communicate so much about internal states or perceived internal states that they have. And I think that's really useful and an element that we'll want in the future, because I was reading this article about how kids are being rude to Alexa because they can be rude to it and it doesn't really get angry, right? It doesn't reply anyway. It just says the same thing. So I think there's, at least for the correct development of children, it's important that these things, you kind of react differently. I also think, you walk in your home and you have a personal robot, and if you're really pissed, presumably the robot should kind of behave slightly differently than when you're super happy and excited. But it's really hard because I don't know, the way I would think about it and the way I thought about it when it came to in expressing goals or intentions for robots, it's, well, what's really happening is that instead of doing robotics where you have your state and you have your action space and you have your space, the reward function that you're trying to optimize, now you kind of have to expand the notion of state to include this human internal state. What is the person actually perceiving? What do they think about the robots, something or rather? And then you have to optimize in that system. And so that means you have to understand how your motion, your actions end up sort of influencing the observer's kind of perception of you. And it's very hard to write math about that.
Right. So when you start to think about incorporating the human into the state model, apologize for the philosophical question, but how complicated are human beings, do you think? Like, can they be reduced to a kind of almost like an object that moves and maybe has some basic intents? Or is there something, do we have to model things like mood and general aggressiveness and all these kinds of human qualities, or like game theoretic qualities? Like, what's your sense?
How complicated is...
How hard is the problem of human-robot interaction?
Yeah. Should we talk about what the problem of human-robot interaction is?
Yeah, what is human-robot interaction?
And then talk about how that, yeah. So, and by the way, I'm going to talk about this very particular view of human-robot interaction, right? Which is not so much on the social side or on the side of how do you have a good conversation with the robot? What should the robot's appearance be? It turns out that if you make robots taller versus shorter, this has an effect on how people act with them. So I'm not talking about that. Yeah. But I'm talking about this very kind of narrow thing, which is if you want to take a task that a robot can do in isolation, in a lab out there in the world, but in isolation. And now you're asking, what does it mean for the robot to be able to do this task for presumably what its actually end goal is, which is to help some person? Mm-hmm. That ends up changing the problem in two ways. The first way it changes the problem is that the robot is no longer the single agent acting. That you have humans who also take actions in that same space. Cars navigate around people, robots around an office, navigate around the people in that office. If I send the robot over there in the cafeteria to get me a coffee, then there's probably other people reaching for stuff in the same space. And so now you have your robot and you're in charge of the actions that the robot is taking. Then you have these people who are also making decisions and taking actions in that same space. And even if, the robot knows what it should do and all of that, just coexisting with these people, right? Kind of getting the actions to gel well, to mesh well together. That's sort of the kind of problem number one. And then there's problem number two, which goes back to this notion of, if I'm a programmer, I can specify some objective for the robot to go off and optimize. I can specify the task. But if I put the robot in your home, presumably you might have your own opinions about, well, okay, I want my house cleaned, but how do I want it cleaned? And how should the robot move? How close to me it should come and all of that. And so I think those are the two differences that you have. You're acting around people, and what you should be optimizing for should satisfy the preferences of that end user, not of your programmer who programmed you.
Yeah, and the preferences thing is tricky. So figuring out those preferences, be able to interactively adjust to understand what the human is doing. So it really boils down to understand the humans in order to interact with them and in order to please them.
Right.
So why is this hard?
Why is understanding humans hard? So I think there's two tasks about understanding humans that in my mind are very, very similar, but not everyone agrees. So there's the task of being able to just anticipate what people will do. We all know that cars need to do this, right? We all know that, well, if I navigate around some people, the robot has to get some notion of, okay, where is this person gonna be? So that's kind of the prediction side. And then there's what you were saying, satisfying the preferences, right? So adapting to the person's preferences, knowing what to optimize for, which is more this inference side, what does this person want? What is their intent? What are their preferences? And to me, those kind of go together, because I think that if at the very least, if you can understand, if you can look at human behavior and understand what it is that they want, then that's sort of the key enabler to being able to anticipate what they'll do in the future. Because I think that, we're not arbitrary. We make these decisions that we make, we act in the way we do because we're trying to achieve certain things. And so I think that's the relationship between them. Now, how complicated do these models need to be in order to be able to understand what people want? So we've gotten a long way in robotics with something called inverse reinforcement learning, which is the notion of someone acts, demonstrates how they want the thing done.
What is an inverse reinforcement learning? You briefly said it.
Right. So it's the problem of take human behavior and infer reward function from this. Figure out what it is that behavior is optimal with respect to. And it's a great way to think about learning human preferences in the sense of, you have a car and the person can drive it, and then you can say, well, okay, I can actually learn what the person is optimizing for. I can learn their driving style, or you can have people demonstrate how they want the house clean, and then you can say, okay, this is I'm getting the trade-offs that they're making. I'm getting the preferences that they want out of this. And so we've been successful in robotics somewhat with this, and it's based on a very simple model of human behavior. It's remarkably simple, which is that human behavior is optimal with respect to whatever it is that people want, right? So you make that assumption, and now you can kind of inverse through. That's why it's called inverse, really optimal control, but also inverse reinforcement learning. So this is based on utility maximization in economics. Right? So back in the 40s, von Neumann Morgenstern were like, okay, people are making choices by maximizing utility. Go. And then in the late 50s, we had Luce and Shepard come in and say, people are a little bit noisy and approximate in that process. So they might choose something kind of stochastically with probability proportional to how much utility something has. So there's a bit of noise in there. This has translated into robotics and something that we call Boltzmann rationality. So it's a kind of an evolution of inverse reinforcement learning that accounts for human noise. And we've had some success with that too for these tasks where it turns out people act noisily enough that you can't just do the vanilla version. You can account for noise and still infer what they seem to want based on this. Then now we're hitting tasks where that's not enough. And
what are examples?
What are examples?
Tasks?
So imagine you're trying to control some robot that's fairly complicated. You're trying to control a robot arm because maybe you're a patient with a motor impairment and you have this wheelchair-mounted arm and you're trying to control it around. Or one task that we've looked at with Sergey is, and our student Sid, is a lunar lander. So I don't know if you know this Atari game, it's called Lunar Lander. It's really hard. People really suck at landing the thing. Mostly they just crash it left and right. Okay, so this is the kind of task where imagine you're trying to provide some assistance to a person operating such a robot, where you want the autonomy to kick in, figure out what it is that you're trying to do and help you do it. It's really hard to do that for, say, Lunar Lander because people are all over the place. And so they seem much more noisy than really irrational. That's an example of a task where these models are kind of failing us. And it's not surprising because, so we talked about the 40s, utility, late 50s, sort of noisy. Then the 70s came and behavioral economics started being a thing where people are like, no. People are not rational. People are messy and emotional and irrational and have all sorts of heuristics that might be domain specific, and they're just a mess.
It's a mess.
So what does my robot do to understand what you want? And it's very that's why it's complicated. It's for the most part we get away with pretty simple models until we don't. And then the question is, what do you do then? And I had days when I wanted to, pack my bags and go home and switch jobs, because it feels really daunting to make sense of human behavior enough that you can reliably understand what people want, especially as, robot capabilities will continue to get developed. You'll get these systems that are more and more capable of all sorts of things. And then you really want to make sure that you're telling them the right thing to do. What is that thing? Well, read it in human behavior.
So if I just sat here quietly and tried to understand something about you by listening to you talk, it would be harder than if I got to say something and ask you and interact and control. Can the robot help its understanding of the human by influencing the behavior by actually acting?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's been exciting to me lately is this notion that when you try to when you try to think of the robotics problem as, okay, I have a robot and it needs to optimize for whatever it is that a person wants it to optimize, as opposed to maybe what a programmer said, that problem we think of as a human-robot collaboration problem, in which both agents get to act, in which the robot knows less than the human, because the human actually has access to, at least implicitly, to what it is that they want. They can't write it down, but they can talk about it. They can give all sorts of signals. They can demonstrate. But the robot doesn't need to sit there and passively observe human behavior and try to make sense of it. The robot can act too. And so there's these information gathering actions that the robot can take to sort of solicit responses that are actually informative. So, for instance, this is not for the purpose of assisting people, but with kind of back to coordinating with people in cars and all of that. One thing that Dorsa did was, so we were looking at cars being able to navigate around people, and you might not know exactly the driving style of a particular individual that's next to you, but you want to change lanes in front of them.
Navigating around other humans inside cars?
Yeah, good clarification question. So if you have an autonomous car and it's trying to navigate the road around human-driven vehicles. Similar ideas apply to pedestrians as well, but let's just take human-driven vehicles. So now you're trying to change a lane. Well, you could be trying to infer this driving style of this person next to you. You'd like to know if they're sort of aggressive or defensive, if they're going to let you kind of go in or if they're going to not.
Right.
And it's very difficult to just, if you think that, if you want to hedge your bets and say, maybe they're actually pretty aggressive, I shouldn't try this, you kind of end up driving next to them, right? And then you don't know, because you're not actually getting the observations that you get. The way someone drives when they're next to you and they just need to go straight is kind of the same, regardless if they're aggressive or defensive. And so you need to enable the robot to reason about how it might actually be able to gather information by changing the actions that it's taking. And then the robot comes up with these cool things where it kind of nudges towards you and then sees if you're gonna slow down or not. And if you slow down, it sort of updates its model of you and says, oh, okay, you're more on the defensive side, so now I can actually lane.
That's a fascinating dance. That's so cool that you could sort of use your own actions to gather information. That feels like a totally open, exciting new world of robotics. I mean, how many people are even thinking about that kind of thing?
A handful of us, I'd say.
Because it's rare, because it's actually leveraging human. I mean, most roboticists I've talked to a lot of, colleagues and so on, are kind of, for being honest, kind of afraid of humans.
Because they're messy and complicated,
yeah, exactly.
Right? I understand. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, right now we're kind of in this dilemma of, okay, there are tasks that we can just assume people are approximately rational for, and we can figure out what they want. We can figure out their goals. We can figure out their driving styles, whatever. Cool. There are these tasks that we can't. So what do, right? Do we pack our bags and go home? And I've had a little bit of hope recently. And I'm kind of doubting myself, because what do I know that, 50 years of behavioral economics hasn't figured out. But maybe it's not really in contradiction with the way that field is headed. But basically, one thing that we've been thinking about is, instead of kind of giving up and saying people are too crazy and irrational for us to make sense of them, maybe we can give them a bit the benefit of the doubt, and maybe we can think of them as actually being relatively rational, but just under different assumptions about the world, about how the world works, about, they don't have, when we think about rationality, implicit assumption is, oh, they're rational under all the same assumptions and constraints as the robot, right? What if this is the state of the world? That's what they know. This is the transition function. That's what they know. This is the horizon. That's what they know. But maybe kind of this difference, the reason they can seem a little messy and hectic, especially to robots, is that perhaps they just make different assumptions or have different beliefs. Yeah. So
I mean, that's another fascinating idea, that this our kind of anecdotal desire to say that humans are irrational, perhaps grounded in behavioral economics, is that we just don't understand the constraints and the rewards under which they operate. And so our goal shouldn't be to throw our hands up and say they're irrational. It's to say, let's try to understand what are the constraints.
What it is that they must be assuming that makes this behavior make sense.
That's
good
brilliant.
life lesson, right? Good life lesson.
Yeah, it's true. It's just outside of robotics. That's just good to, that's communicating with humans. That's just a good, assume that you just don't sort of empathy, right?
Maybe there's something you're missing, and it's, it especially happens to robots because they're kind of dumb and they don't know things, and oftentimes people are just super rational and that they actually know a lot of things that robots don't. Sometimes, like with the lunar lander, the robot, knows much more. So it turns out that if you try to say, look, maybe people are operating this thing, but assuming a much more simplified physics model, because they don't get the complexity of this kind of craft, or the robot arm with 7 degrees of freedom with these inertias and whatever. So maybe they have this intuitive physics model, which is not, this notion of intuitive physics is something that is studied actually in cognitive science, folks like Josh Tenenbaum, Tom Griffith's work on this stuff. And what we found is that you can actually try to figure out what physics model kind of best explains human actions. And then you can use that to sort of correct what it is that they're commanding the craft to do. So they might, be sending the craft somewhere, but instead of executing that action, you can sort of take a step back and say, according to their intuitive, if the world worked according to their intuitive physics model, where do they think that the craft is going? Where are they trying to send it to? And then you can use the real physics, right? The inverse of that to actually figure out what you should do so that you do that instead of where they were actually sending you in the real world. And I kid you not, it worked. People land the damn thing, and in between the two flags and all that. So it's not conclusive in any way, but I'd say it's evidence that, yeah, maybe we're kind of underestimating humans in some ways when we're giving up and saying, yeah, they're just crazy noisy.
So then you try to explicitly model the kind of worldview that they have.
That they have. That's right. And it's not too, there's things in behavioral economics too that for instance, have touched upon the planning horizon. So there's this idea that there's bounded rationality essentially. Right. And the idea that, well, maybe we work under computational constraints. And I think kind of our view recently has been, take the Bellman update in AI and just break it in all sorts of ways by saying state, no, the person doesn't get to see the real state. Maybe they're estimating somehow. Transition function, no. Even the actual reward evaluation, maybe they're still learning about what it is that they want. Like when you watch Netflix and you have all the things and then you have to pick something. Imagine that, the AI system interpreted that choice as this is the thing you prefer to see. Like, how are you going to know? You're still trying to figure out what you like, what you don't like, etc. So I think it's important to also account for that. So it's not irrationality, per se. They're doing the right thing under the things that they know.
Yeah, that's brilliant. You mentioned recommender systems. What kind of, and we were talking about human-robot interaction, what kind of problem spaces are you thinking about? So is it robots, like wheeled robots with autonomous vehicles? Is it object manipulation? Like when you think about human-robot interaction in your mind, and maybe I'm sure you can speak for the entire community of human robot interaction. No, but like, what are the problems of interest here? And does it, I kind of think of open domain dialogue as human robot interaction, and that happens not in the physical space, but it could just happen in the virtual space. So where's the boundaries of this field for you when you're thinking about the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I tried to find kind of underlying, I don't know what to even call them. I could try to work on, I might call what I do the kind of working on the foundations of algorithmic human robot interaction and trying to make contributions there. And it's important to me that whatever we do is actually somewhat domain agnostic when it comes to, is it about, autonomous cars, or is it about quadrotors, or is it about, it's just sort of the same underlying principles apply. Of course, when you're trying to get a particular domain to work, you usually have to do some extra work to adapt that to that particular domain. But these things that we were talking about around, well, how do you model humans? It turns out that a lot of systems need to core benefit from a better understanding of how human behavior relates to what people want, and need to predict human behavior, physical robots of all sorts, and beyond that. And so I used to do manipulation. I used to be, picking up stuff, and then I was picking up stuff with people around. And now it's sort of very broad when it comes to the application level, but in a sense very focused on, okay, how does the problem need to change? How do the algorithms need to change when we're not doing a robot by itself, emptying the dishwasher, but we're stepping outside of that?
A thought that popped into my head just now, on the game theoretic side of things, you said this really interesting idea of using actions to gain more information. But if we think of sort of game theory, the humans that are interacting with you, the robot. Wow, I'm taking the identity of the robot.
Yeah, I do that all the time.
Yeah, they also have a world model of you, and you can manipulate that. I mean, if we look at autonomous vehicles, people have a certain viewpoint. You said with the kids, people see Alexa as in a certain way. Is there some value in trying to also optimize how people see you as a robot? Is that a little too far in away from the specifics of what we can solve right now?
So we can both, right? So
Yes.
It's really interesting, and we've seen a little bit of progress on this problem, on pieces of this problem. So you can. Again, it kind of comes down to how complicated does the human model need to be. But in one piece of work that we were looking at, we just said, okay, there's these parameters that are internal to the robot, and they're what the robot is about to do, or maybe what driving style the robot has, or something like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up a system where part of the state is the person's belief over those parameters. And now when the robot acts, that the person gets new evidence about this robot internal state. And so they're updating their mental model of the robot, right? So if they see a card that sort of cuts someone off, they're like, oh, that's an aggressive card. They know more, right? If they see sort of a robot head towards a particular door, they're like, oh, yeah, the robot's trying to get to that door. So this thing that we have to do with humans to try to understand their goals and intentions, humans are inevitably going to do that to robots. And then that raises this interesting question that you asked, which is, can we do something about that? This is going to happen inevitably, but we can sort of be more confusing or less confusing to people. And it turns out you can optimize for being more informative and less confusing if you have an understanding of how your actions are being interpreted by the human, how they're using these actions to update their belief. And honestly, all we did is just Bayes' rule. Basically, yeah. Okay, the person has a belief, they see an action, they make some assumptions about how the robot generates its actions, presumably as being rational, because robots are rational. It's reasonable to assume that about them. And then they incorporate that new piece of evidence, the Bayesian sense, in their belief, and they obtain a posterior. And now the robot is trying to figure out what actions to take such that it steers the person's belief to put as much probability mass as possible on the correct parameters.
So that's kind of a mathematical formalization of that. But my worry, and I don't know if you want to go there with me, but I talk about this quite a bit. The kids talking to Alexa disrespectfully worries me. I worry in general about human nature. Like I said, I grew up in the Soviet Union, World War II. I'm a Jew too, so with the Holocaust and everything. I just worry about how we humans sometimes treat the other, the group that we call the other, whatever that is. Through human history, the group that's the other has been changed faces. Mm-hmm. But it seems like the robot will be the other, the next other. And one thing is, it feels to me that robots don't get no respect.
They get shoved around.
And is there one at the shallow level? For a better experience, it seems that robots need to talk back a little bit. Like, my intuition says, I mean, most companies from sort of Roomba, autonomous vehicle companies might not be so happy with the idea that a robot has a little bit of an attitude. But it feels to me that that's necessary to create a compelling experience. Like, we humans don't seem to respect anything that doesn't give us some attitude. Or like a mix of mystery and attitude and anger, and that threatens us subtly, maybe passive aggressively. I don't know. It seems like we humans need that. Is there something you have thoughts on this?
Okay, I'll give you two thoughts on it.
Okay, sure.
One is we respond to someone being assertive, but we also respond to someone being vulnerable. So I think my first thought is that robots get shoved around and bullied a lot because they're sort of, tempting and they're sort of showing off, or they appear to be showing off. And so I think going back to these things we were talking about in the beginning of making robots a little more expressive, a little bit more like, that wasn't cool to do, and now I'm bummed, right? I think that can actually help, because people can't help but anthropomorphize and respond to that. Even that, though, the emotion being communicated is not in any way a real thing, and people know that it's not a real thing because they know it's just a machine. We still interpret, we watch, there's this famous psychology experiment with little triangles and kind of dots on a screen, and a triangle is chasing the square, and you get really angry at the darn triangle because why is it not leaving the square alone? So that's we can't help. So that was the first thought.
The vulnerability, that's really interesting. I think of like being pushing back, being assertive as the only mechanism of forming a connection, of getting respect, but perhaps vulnerability. Perhaps there's other mechanisms that are less threatening.
Yeah.
Is there?
I think, a little bit, yes. But then this other thing that we can think about is, it goes back to what you were saying, that interaction is really game theoretic, right? So the moment you're taking actions in a space, humans are taking actions in that same space, but you have your own objective, which is, you're a car, you need to get your passenger to the destination. And then the human nearby has their own objective, which somewhat overlaps with you, but not entirely. You're not interested in getting into an accident with each other, but you have different destinations, and you want to get home faster, and they want to get home faster. And that's a general sum game at that point. And so I think that's what, treating it as such is kind of a way we can step outside of this kind of mode where you try to anticipate what people do and you don't realize you have any influence over it, while still protecting yourself, because you're understanding that people also understand that they can influence you. And it's just kind of back and forth. There's this negotiation, which is really, really talking about different equilibria of a game. The very basic way to solve coordination is to just make predictions about what people will do and then stay out of their way. And that's hard for the reasons we talked about, which is you have to understand people's intentions implicitly, explicitly, who knows, but somehow you have to get enough of an understanding of that to be able to anticipate what happens next. And so that's challenging. But then it's further challenged by the fact that people change what they do based on what you do, because they don't plan in isolation either, right? So when you see cars trying to merge on a highway and not succeeding, one of the reasons this can be is because they look at traffic that keeps coming, they predict what these people are planning on doing, which is to just keep going, and then they stay out of the way because there's no feasible plan, right? Any plan would actually intersect with one of these other people, so that's bad. So you get stuck there. So now, kind of, if you start thinking about it as no, actually, these people change what they do depending on what the car does. Like if the car actually tries to kind of inch itself forward, they might actually slow down and let the car in. And now taking advantage of that, well, that's kind of the next level. We call this like this underactuated system idea, where it's an underactuated system in robotics, but you influence these other degrees of freedom, but you don't get to decide what they do.
I've somewhere seen you mention it, the human element in this picture as underactuated. So you understand underactuated robotics is that you can't fully control the system. So
you can't go in arbitrary directions in the configuration space.
Under your control.
Yeah, it's a very simple way of underactuation, where basically there's literally these degrees of freedom that you can control and these degrees of freedom that you can't, but you influence them. And I think that's the important part, is that they don't do whatever regardless of what you do, that what you do influences what they end up doing.
I just also like the poetry of calling human-robot interaction an underactuated robotics problem. And you also mentioned sort of nudging. It seems that I don't know, I think about this a lot in the case of pedestrians. I've collected hundreds of hours of videos. I like to just watch pedestrians. And it seems that...
it's a funny hobby.
Yeah, it's weird. Because I learn a lot. I learn a lot about myself, about our human behavior from watching pedestrians, watching people in their environment. Basically, crossing the street is like you're putting your life on the line. I don't know, tens of millions of times in America every day, as people are just like playing this weird game of chicken when they cross the street, especially when there's some ambiguity about the right of way. That has to do either with the rules of the road or with the general personality of the intersection based on the time of day and so on. I mean, and this nudging idea, I don't, it seems that people don't even nudge. They just aggressively make a decision. Somebody, there's a runner that gave me this advice. I sometimes run in the street and, not in the street, on the sidewalk. And they said that if you don't make eye contact with people when you're running, they will all move out of your way.
It's called civil inattention.
Civil inattention, that's the thing. Oh, wow, I need to look this up. But it works. What is that? My sense was if you communicate, like, confidence in your actions, that you're unlikely to deviate from the action that you're following, that's a really powerful signal to others that they need to plan around your actions. As opposed to nudging where you're sort of hesitantly, the hesitation might communicate that you're still in the dance, in the game that they can influence with their own actions. I've recently had a conversation with Jim Keller, who's a sort of this legendary chip architect, but he also led the autopilot team for a while. And his intuition that driving is fundamentally still like a ballistics problem. Like, you can ignore the human element, that it's just not hitting things, and you can kind of learn the right dynamics required to do the merger and all those kinds of things. And then my sense is, and I don't know if I can provide sort of definitive proof of this, but my sense is like an order of magnitude or more difficult when humans are involved. Like, it's not simply object collision avoidance problem. Where does your intuition, of course nobody knows the right answer here, but where does your intuition fall on the fundamental difficulty of the driving problem when humans are involved?
Yeah, Good question. I have many opinions on this. Imagine downtown San Francisco.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy, busy, everything. Okay, now take all the humans out. No pedestrians, no human-driven vehicles, no cyclists, no people on little electric scooters zipping around, nothing. I think we're done. I think driving at that point is done. We're done. There's nothing really still needs to be solved about that.
So, well, let's pause there. I think I agree with you. And I think a lot of people that will hear will agree with that. But we need to sort of internalize that idea. So what's the problem there? Because we might not quite yet be done with that. Because a lot of people kind of focus on the perception problem. A lot of people kind of map autonomous driving into how close are we to solving being able to detect all the the drivable area, the objects in the scene. Do you see that as how hard is that problem? So your intuition there behind your statement was we might have not solved it yet, but we're close to solving basically the perception problem.
I think the perception problem, and by the way, a bunch of years ago, this would not have been true. And a lot of issues in the space were coming from the fact that, we don't really, we don't know what's where. But I think it's fairly safe to say that at this point, although you could always improve on things and all of that, you can drive through downtown San Francisco if there are no people around. There's no really perception issues standing in your way there. I think perception is hard, but yeah, we've made a lot of progress on the perception side. Not to undermine the difficulty of the problem. I think everything about robotics is really difficult, of course. I think that the planning problem, the control problem, all very difficult. But I think what makes it really yeah, it might be. I picked downtown San Francisco. Adapting to, now it's snowing, now it's no longer snowing, now it's slippery in this way, now it's the dynamics part I could imagine being still somewhat challenging. But
no, the thing that I think worries us and our intuition is not good there is the perception problem at the edge cases. Sort of downtown San Francisco, the nice thing, it's not actually, it may not be a good example because
you know what you're getting from. Well, there's crazy construction zones and all of that.
Yeah, but the thing is, you're traveling at slow speeds, so it doesn't feel dangerous. To me, what feels dangerous is highway speeds, when everything is, to us humans, super clear.
Yeah, I'm assuming LiDAR here, by the way. I think it's kind of irresponsible to not use LiDAR. That's just my personal opinion. Depending on your use case, but I think if you have the opportunity to use LiDAR, good, and in a lot of cases you might not.
Good, your intuition makes more sense now. So you don't think vision?
I really just don't know enough to say, vision alone, what's there's a lot of, how many cameras do you have? Is it how are you using them?
Right,
I don't know.
Details.
There's all sorts of details. I imagine there's stuff that's really hard to actually see. How do you deal with glare? Exactly what you were saying. Stuff that people would see that you don't. I think I have more of my intuition comes from systems that can actually use LiDAR as well.
Yeah, and until we know for sure, it makes sense to be using LiDAR. That's kind of the safety focus. But then there's sort of I also sympathize with the Elon Musk statement of LiDAR as a crutch. It's a fun notion to think that the things that work today is a crutch for the invention of the things that will work tomorrow, right? It's kind of true in the sense that if we want to stick to the comfort zone. You see this in academic and research settings all the time. The things that work force you to not explore outside, think outside the box. That happens all the time. The problem is in the safety critical systems, you kind of want to stick with the things that work. So it's an interesting and difficult trade-off in the case of real world sort of safety critical robotic systems. But so your intuition is, just to clarify,
yes.
how hard is this human element? How hard is driving when this human element is involved? years, decades away from solving it. But perhaps actually the year isn't the thing I'm asking. It doesn't matter what the timeline is. But do you think how many breakthroughs are we away from in solving the human robot interaction problem to get this right?
I think it, in a sense, it really depends. I think that, we were talking about how, well, look, it's really hard because anticipating what people do is hard. And on top of that, playing the game is hard. But I think we sort of have the fundamental, some of the fundamental understanding for that. And then you already see that these systems are being deployed in the real world. Even driverless. Like, there's, I think now, a few companies that don't have a driver in the car in some small areas.
I got a chance to. I went to Phoenix and I shot a video with Waymo. I need to get that video out. People have been giving me slack, but there's incredible engineering work being done there, and it's one of those other seminal moments for me in my life to be able to. It sounds silly, but to be able to drive without a driver in the seat. I mean, that was an incredible robotics. I was driven by a robot, without being able to take over, without being able to take the steering wheel. That's a magical moment. So in that regard, in those domains, at least for like Waymo, they're solving that human. They're going. It felt fast because you're like freaking out at first. This is my first experience, but it's going like the speed limit, right? 30, 40, whatever it is. And there's humans and it deals with them quite well. It detects them, it negotiates the intersections, the left turns and all of that. So at least in those domains, it's solving them. The open question for me is like, how quickly can we expand? That's outside of the weather conditions, all those kinds of things, how quickly can we expand to like cities like San Francisco?
Yeah. And I wouldn't say that it's just, now it's just pure engineering and it's probably and by the way, I'm speaking kind of very generally here as hypothesizing, but I think that there are successes and yet no one is everywhere out there. So that seems to suggest that things can be expanded and can be scaled, and we know how to do a lot of things, but there's still probably, new algorithms or modified algorithms that you still need to put in there as you learn more and more about new challenges that you get faced with.
How much of this problem do you think can be learned through end-to-end? There's the success of machine learning and reinforcement learning. How much of it can be learned from sort of data from scratch, and how much, which most of the success of autonomous vehicle systems have a lot of heuristics and rule-based stuff on top, like human expertise injected, forced into the system to make it work. What's your sense? How much? What will be the role of learning in the near term? Long term?
I think on the one hand that learning is inevitable here, right? I think on the other hand that when people characterize the problem as it's a bunch of rules that some people wrote down, right, versus it's an end-to-end RL system or imitation learning, then maybe there's kind of something missing from maybe that's more. So for instance, I think a very, very useful tool in this sort of problem, both in how to generate the car's behavior and robots in general, and how to model human beings, is actually planning, search optimization, right? So robotics is this sequential decision-making problem. And when a robot can figure out on its own how to achieve its goal without hitting stuff and all that stuff, right? All the good stuff for motion planning 101, I think of that as very much AI, not this is some rule or something. There's nothing rule-based around that, right? It's just you're searching through a space and figuring out, or you're optimizing through a space and figure out what seems to be the right thing to do. And I think it's hard to just do that because you need to learn models of the world. And I think it's hard to just do the learning part where you don't bother with any of that, because then you're saying, well, I could do imitation, but then when I go off distribution, I'm really screwed. Or you can say, I can do reinforcement learning, which adds a lot of robustness, but then you have to do either reinforcement learning in the real world, which sounds a little challenging, or that trial and error, or you have to do reinforcement learning in simulation. And then that means, well, guess what? You need to model things, at least to model people, model the world enough that whatever policy you get of that is like actually fine to roll out in the world and do some additional learning there. So,
do you think simulation, by the way, just a quick tangent, has a role in the human-robot interaction space? Like, is it useful? It seems like humans, everything we've been talking about, are difficult to model and simulate. Do you think simulation has a role in this space?
I do. I think so, because you can take models and train with them ahead of time, for instance. You can...
But the models, sorry to interrupt, the models are sort of human constructed or learned?
I think they have to be a combination, because if you get some human data and then you say, this is going to be my model of the person, whether for simulation and training or for just deployment time, and that's what I'm planning with as my model of how people work. Regardless, if you take some data and you don't assume anything else, and you just say, okay, this is some data that I've collected. Let me fit a policy to how people work based on that. What tends to happen is you collected some data in some distribution, and then now your robot sort of computes a best response to that, right? It's sort of like, what should I do if this is how people work? And easily goes off of distribution, where that model that you built of the human completely sucks, because out of distribution, you have no idea, right? If you think of all the possible policies, and then you take only the ones that are consistent with the human data that you've observed, that still leaves a lot of things could happen outside of that distribution where you're confident and you know what's going on.
By the way, that's such a... I've gotten used to this terminology of out of distribution, but it's such a machine learning terminology, because it kind of assumes, so distribution is referring to the data that you've
set of states that you encountered.
That you've encountered so far at training time.
Yeah. But
it kind of also implies that there's a nice, like, statistical model that represents that data. So out of distribution feels like, I don't know, it raises to me philosophical questions of how we humans reason out of distribution, reason about things that are completely we haven't seen before.
And what we're talking about here is, how do we reason about what other people do in situations where we haven't seen them, and somehow we just magically navigate that. I can anticipate what will happen in situations that are even novel in many ways. And I have a pretty good intuition for it. I don't always get it right, but, and I might be a little uncertain and so on. But I think it's this, that if you just rely on data, there's just too many possibilities. There's too many policies out there that fit the data. And by the way, it's not just state. It's really kind of history of state, because to really be able to anticipate what the person will do, it kind of depends on what they've been doing so far, because that's the information you need to kind of, at least implicitly, sort of say, this is the kind of person that this is probably what they're trying to do. So anyway, it's like you're trying to map history of states to actions. There's many mappings.
And history meaning like the last few seconds, or the last few minutes, or the last few months?
Who knows? Okay. Who knows how much you need, right? In terms of if your state is really like the positions of everything or whatnot, and velocities. Who knows how much you need? And then there's so many mappings. And so now you're talking about, how do you regularize that space? What priors do you impose? Or what's the inductive bias? So, there's all very related things to think about it. Basically, what are assumptions that we should be making such that these models actually generalize outside of the data that we've seen? And now you're talking about, well, I don't know. What can you assume? Maybe you can assume that people actually have intentions, and that's what drives their actions. Maybe